Imagine stepping back thousands of years into the dimly lit chambers of ancient Egypt. What if I told you the process of preparing a body for the afterlife was far more elaborate and shrouded in more mystery than you ever imagined? We're about to uncover the shocking secrets of the embalmers' rituals, so intricate they defy modern understanding. The chamber is quiet. You can almost hear the slow crackle of an oil lamp, its flame wavering against mud brick walls painted with fading figures of gods. The work of the embalmers was never loud, never hurried. It was not meant to be. Death, for the ancient Egyptians, was the slowest of journeys. The embalmer's task was not to rush, but to guide the deceased toward eternity with patience, precision, and ritual. You, listening now, might imagine yourself stepping into that dim space, where silence itself seemed a part of the ritual. Death in ancient Egypt was never just the end of life. It was a transition, a long preparation for a voyage beyond the desert, beyond the Nile into the field of reeds, that eternal afterworld where life continued in a perfected form. Yet, unlike the world of the living, where food rotted, skin decayed, and bodies dissolved into the earth, the world of eternity demanded permanence. To exist forever, one's body had to remain, and so the work of the embalmers was born. But these embalmers, contrary to the romantic images of priests in golden masks that modern imaginations might hold, were ordinary men belonging to a secretive profession. They were craftsmen of death, often working in quiet, practical surroundings that smelled not of incense alone, but of resin, salt, and the sharp bite of chemicals drawn from the desert. They formed a class, apart respected for their knowledge, but kept at a distance because of their contact with the dead. Their chambers, the places where mummification was carried out, were not grand temples, but workshops, dim, quiet rooms near the edges of cities, often not far from the necropolises where the bodies would rest. When a person died in Egypt, the process did not begin immediately. First came the summons. The family of the deceased would approach the embalming workshop and negotiate the rites. As with everything in life, there were choices, and the embalmer's services came at different prices. Herodotus, the Greek historian, who traveled in Egypt around the 5th century BCE, recorded that embalmers offered 3 different levels of embalming. The most expensive, which promised the highest chance of eternal preservation; a middle process, less costly but still elaborate; and a poor man's version, stripped down to essentials. In this way, embalming was not just religious, it was economic, a negotiation between family wealth and the hope of eternity. If the family chose the finest method, then the preparation began almost immediately. The body was brought to the workshop, often carried in discreet fashion, sometimes under cover, for though death was familiar, the rituals were not to be casually displayed. The embalming place was called the Ibu, or place of purification. It was here, in this quiet chamber, that the real work began. The first ritual step was washing. The deceased was laid upon a slanted wooden board, a kind of table with a slight incline, so that liquids used in the process could drain away. Cold water from the Nile was poured over the body, sometimes mixed with palm wine, which served as a natural cleanser. The embalmers did not rush. Their work was steady, rhythmic, like craftsmen preparing a vessel or carving stone. Water, that most sacred of elements in Egyptian thought, was the first gift to the deceased to return to purity. a washing away of earthly soil before the longer journey. Next came the task that most unsettled foreigners who wrote about Egypt, the removal of the internal organs. To the Egyptians, this was both practical and spiritual. The heart, in particular, had to be carefully considered. Unlike the brain, which they discarded, the heart was seen as the seat of memory, morality, and personhood. It might be left inside, or replaced by an amulet shaped like a heart, depending on tradition and the family's choices. The lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver were removed with careful incisions, then dried and preserved separately, each placed in canopic jars, guarded by protective deities. This was no casual dissection, but a ritual act, with prayers murmured over each stage. What is striking, when you imagine this scene, is how ordinary it must have appeared to those who performed it day after day. To us, the act of cutting into a body is dramatic, unsettling. To the embalmer, it was work of profession, something done with skilled hands in the quiet of the chamber. Like a carpenter shaving wood, or a potter shaping clay, the embalmer worked with patience and familiarity, guided by ritual but practiced in method. The use of natron followed. Natron was the desert's own gift, a natural salt harvested from dried lake beds, composed of sodium carbonate, bicarbonate, and small traces of other minerals. It absorbed moisture like nothing else. Without natron, preservation would have been impossible. Once the organs were removed, the entire body was packed with natron, covered in it, buried in it. For 40 days the body remained this way, slowly, drying, its flesh losing water, its skin tightening, until the softness of mortality gave way to something leathery, resistant, lasting. During this time, families might visit, bringing offerings or waiting for news of progress. Embalmers themselves, however, guarded the chamber. They were the keepers of silence, and their work was hidden. The process was not meant to be seen by outsiders. It belonged to the ritual and the mystery. What took place inside the embalming house was as much about secrecy as it was about skill. It is here that we glimpse the unseen nature of their work. For while Egyptian art depicted funerals, tombs, and priests, it rarely depicted the actual labor of embalming. This absence is itself telling. The embalmers were necessary, but their craft was not celebrated in imagery. It was hidden, silent. Much like the bodies they worked upon, imagine the chamber after the first week. The body lies beneath its covering of salt. The room smells faintly of resin and palm wine, but also of decay held in check. The lamp continues to burn. The perhaps sitting cross-legged nearby, keeps watch, waiting for the days to pass. It was not an immediate process, but one of patience, of allowing the desert's own minerals to do their work. And yet, beyond these slow, practical steps, questions linger. How much of what we think we know about these rituals is filtered through the writings of outsiders like Herodotus, who marveled at what he saw but may not have fully understood? How much remains lost, hidden in the silences of the embalmers themselves, who passed their skills not through public inscription, but private apprenticeship? As you picture this quiet chamber, the body slowly drying in natron, the embalmers waiting, the family hovering in hope, you might wonder, what did it feel like for those craftsmen of death to know that their work was meant to last not decades, not centuries, but thousands of years? Did they believe they were preserving eternity, or simply following tradition, day after day, in the silence of their workshops. When the body had been carefully covered in natron, the chamber entered into a new rhythm. The work of embalming was not only a matter of tools and cuts, but of waiting. 40 days, that was the time required for the natural salts to do their work, pulling water from every pore, shrinking flesh, and transforming what had once been living tissue into something resembling permanence. The embalmer's craft was therefore measured not just in hours of labor, but in patience, silence, and cycles of WATCHFULNESS. To imagine this period, you must picture the embalming workshop not as a place of constant action, but as a place of long intervals. The first incisions had already been made, the organs carefully removed and preserved, the body arranged on its slanted board. Now the true work belonged to time itself, aided by natron, the mineral of the desert. Rather than stepping away entirely, remained nearby, attending to the body at intervals, checking the slow transformation. These workshops, called pernifair, or House of Beauty, were often situated near the necropolis, at the edge of towns where the living gave way to the silent world of the dead. Archaeological evidence suggests that these were not monumental temples, but practical spaces, modest mud-brick buildings, shaded courtyards, and inner rooms where only the embalmers themselves were allowed to go. The families might wait outside, but they rarely saw the details of the work. The embalmers maintained a secrecy that protected both their knowledge and their position in society. Inside, daily life followed a quiet rhythm. Oil lamps burned steadily, filling the air with faint smoke. Clay jars, filled with resins, perfumes, and oils, lined the shelves. Bundles of linen awaited their time. Natron itself was stored in sacks or shallow basins, ready to be reapplied. If needed, the body, resting under its white covering of salt, occupied the center of the space, raised slightly on its board to allow drainage. For the embalmers, these days were not idle. Their role during the waiting period was both practical and ritualistic. Each morning they would enter the chamber and check the body. Was the natron absorbing properly? Did the skin tighten in the right way? If moisture still clung to certain parts, more natron might be packed in. The mouth, the nostrils, the eyes, these delicate openings were carefully watched, for they were places where decay could begin if not attended to. Beyond these checks, there were rituals. Purification rites were repeated, small prayers whispered, sometimes with incense burning. The god Anubis was often invoked, he who guided the dead and watched over embalmers. In Egyptian art, Anubis is depicted as a jackal-headed figure bending over the body of the deceased, a silent guardian of this sacred craft. For the embalmers, their daily work may have felt like an extension of his presence. They were, in a sense, acting as his hands upon earth. Still, one must not romanticize too far. For all its sacredness, the work was also practical labor. The smell of drying flesh, though muted by salt and resin, was part of the atmosphere. The embalmers were skilled, but they were not untouched by the realities of the human body. This is perhaps why their profession carried both respect and unease. They were essential to Egyptian religion, yet their contact with death placed them at a distance from ordinary society. During the 40 days, the family of the deceased would sometimes bring offerings, bread, beer, onions, or jars of wines to sustain the embalmers, or to honor the dead. These offerings reminded everyone involved that death was a community affair. The embalmers were not acting for themselves alone, but for the family, for the deceased, and for the gods who watched over. The process, the body itself, gradually changing, became less a corpse and more an object of devotion. Each day of waiting turned it into something different, no longer fleshly, no longer fragile, but something hardened, darkened, and strangely enduring. By the end of the period, the person once known in life had become the foundation of a body meant to last into eternity. And yet, what did those long days feel like for the embalmers themselves? Imagine their routines. One might begin the day by mixing resin, grinding herbs, or boiling oils to prepare for the later stages. Another might sit with strips of linen, cutting and measuring them for the wrapping phase. Apprentices would carry jars, sweep the floor, or fetch fresh natron from nearby storage. The senior embalmer, meanwhile, would oversee the inspection of the body, murmuring small prayers or checking the progress with practiced eyes. Herodotus describes embalmers as specialized workers, each with their role. Some dealt with the opening of the body, others with the washing, others with the wrapping. This division of labor suggests a kind of quiet industry, like a workshop of artisans. Though silence was expected in the presence of the dead, one can imagine the soft rustle of linen, the scrape of stone tools, the shifting of clay jars, small sounds that filled the otherwise muted air. Meanwhile, time itself worked alongside. Them, the desert climate was harsh, but within the chamber it was controlled. The embalmers knew that patience was as important as skill. If the natron was removed too soon, moisture would remain, and the body would fail. If left too long, the skin might crack. Balance was everything. Thus, each day's inspection mattered, though to an outsider it might have seemed like nothing was happening at all. The 40-day waiting period also had symbolic meaning. In Egyptian thought, numbers carried power. 40 days marked a completeness, a cycle of transition from the realm of the living to the threshold of eternity. The embalmers did not invent this number for convenience. It was embedded in their cosmology, woven into the rhythms of their rituals. Consider, too, the psychological effect of this passage of time. For the family, the death was prolonged. Their loved one had not yet been buried, not yet laid to rest. Instead, he or she was in transition, cared for by specialists whose chambers were hidden from sight. The grief of the family stretched across weeks, punctuated by visits, offerings, and prayers. For the embalmers, death was never sudden. It was always drawn out, slow, a process measured in days and careful attention. Some of the work during this waiting period was unseen in another sense. It left few traces in archaeology. While wrapped mummies and canopic jars survive, the quiet actions of watching, checking, reapplying natron, and murmuring prayers left no artifacts behind, yet these were the moments that defined their daily lives. History remembers the grand tombs of pharaohs, but the true texture of embalming lay in these silent routines. You, listening, might picture the passage of a single day. The sun rises over the Nile, flooding the fields with light. In the necropolis, the embalmers enter their chamber, oil lamps already flickering in the cool interior. They approach the body, check the salt, adjust a covering, whisper a prayer. An apprentice carries water to wash the floor. Another arranges jars on a shelf. The hours pass quietly, punctuated by the slow rhythm of ritual. By evening, they step outside into the desert air, where the sky glows red with sunset. Inside, the body remains, silent and changing, awaiting its transformation. And so it continues day after day, week after week after week, until the 40th day draws near. The body, once fragile, is now hardened, dried, and preserved. The embalmers prepare to move to the next stage, the washing, the anointing with oils, and the long, intricate wrapping that would turn the preserved body into a true mummy. But before we move on, it is worth pausing on a question. Why did the embalmers keep their craft so secret? Why did they not record their methods openly, as they did with so many other crafts and rituals? Was it to protect their profession, to preserve the sacredness of their work, or perhaps because dealing with the dead was seen as something best hidden from everyday life? This silence is part of the unseen rituals of ancient Egyptian embalmers. What they did is partially known through archaeology, partially through the writings of outsiders, but much remains unspoken. As you sit with the image of those 40 days, salt, the waiting, the daily checks, you might wonder how much of this process remains lost forever, carried only in the memories of craftsmen whose names we will never know. The 40 days have passed. The body, once fragile with the softness of mortality, has dried under the silent patience of natron. What was once flesh has become something altogether different, a figure darkened, hardened, and preserved. Now begins the final stage of the embalmer's craft, the wrapping, the rites, the sealing of eternity within linen and prayer. The chamber takes on a different rhythm at this point. For weeks it had been the place of stillness, where waiting defined the work. Now it stirs with more movement, more preparation. Apprentices carry bundles of linen, jars of oil, pots of resin. The embalmers sharpen their focus, for this stage requires not only skill but devotion. To wrap a body was to transform it, step by step, from human remains into an eternal vessel. The body is first washed again. Even after natron, this cleansing is essential. Cold water from the Nile is poured, sometimes infused with aromatic herbs, to remove the dust of the drying period. Palm wine may also be used, its sharpness both cleansing and symbolic. The embalmers carefully dry the figure once more, then begin the anointing. Oils, cedar, myrrh, frankincense, juniper rubbed into the skin, softening what had hardened, perfuming what had dried. This anointing is not only practical, it is a consecration, making the body sacred for its journey into the afterlife. Here, the unseen rituals return again, for not all recipes were known beyond the chambers. Archaeology tells us that resins were imported from distant lands, that oils were mixed with secret ingredients, and that each embalmer guarded his formulas as carefully as any treasure. The scent of these oils filled the chamber, mingling with smoke from burning incense. Imagine the atmosphere, a heavy, resinous perfume that clung to the walls, to the linen, even to the hands of the embalmers themselves. Once anointed, the body was ready for its long winding in linen. This stage could last days, sometimes weeks, depending on wealth and detail. Linen was not simply cloth, it was sacred, woven from the flax that grew in the fertile soil along the Nile, linen symbolized purity. To be wrapped in linen was to be clothed not for burial, but for rebirth. The embalmers did not simply cover the body with one sheet. Instead, they worked layer by layer, strip by strip, each applied with care, each joined with resin to hold it. Firm fingers were wrapped individually, toes too. The head was carefully swathed, the limbs bound, the torso layered in crisscrossing strips. Between layers, amulets were placed. These were small charms made of stone, faience, or gold, each with its own purpose. A scarab over the heart to guide it in judgment, an eye of Horus to ward off harm, knots of Isis for protection, tiny figures of gods and symbols of life, all hidden within the wrappings. With each amulet came a spell. The embalmers murmured words from the Book of the Dead, not a single book, but a collection of incantations and prayers known to priests and passed down through generations. These words gave the charms their power, ensuring that the deceased would be able to speak, breathe, walk, and eat in the afterlife. The wrapping, therefore, was not only physical, it was magical, a layering of words as well as cloth. The themselves did not improvise. Their work followed traditions that had evolved over centuries. And yet, within those traditions, there were variations, some families requesting certain prayers, others commissioning particular amulets. Wealthier households could afford elaborate wrappings, hundreds of yards of linen, dozens of charms. Poorer families might have simpler wrappings, fewer amulets, shorter rituals. But always, the act of wrapping was central. To be wrapped was to be prepared for eternity. One can picture the chamber during this process. Several embalmers working together, passing strips of linen, brushing resin, reciting words. Apprentices moving quietly, handing jars, cutting cloth. The air thick with the smell of warmed resin, sticky and fragrant. The body gradually disappearing under layer after layer, becoming less a person and more a sacred form. In Egyptian art, this final figure was shown as a smooth, idealized shape, head and body unified, arms crossed, the image of timelessness. Yet beneath the smooth exterior lay the careful labor of hands, the hidden charms, the whispered words. After days of wrapping, the body was finally clothed, not only in linen but in eternity. It would then be placed within a coffin, sometimes a simple wooden box, sometimes elaborately painted and carved with protective spells. For pharaohs and nobles, there might be multiple coffins, nested one within another like layers of protection, until finally placed inside a stone sarcophagus. For the less wealthy, the coffin might be plain. But the principle remained. The body was enclosed, guarded, ready. The final rites were then performed. Priests joined the embalmers for the opening of the mouth ceremony, one of the most important rituals in Egyptian funerary practice. The idea was simple yet profound: to restore to the deceased the ability to eat, speak, see, and breathe in the afterlife. Using a ritual adze or other ceremonial tools, the priest touched the mouth, the eyes, the ears, the nose, symbolically reopening the senses that death had closed. Spells were spoken, incense burned, offerings made. The body was not only preserved now, but reanimated for eternity. Only after this final rite did the embalming process truly end. The family would then take possession, leading the coffin in procession toward the tomb. Musicians played, mourners wept, Priests recited further prayers. The embalmers' work, however, was done. Their role had been to preserve, to wrap, to prepare. From here, the journey belonged to the deceased, to the family, and to the gods. Yet even in this moment, the embalmers remained unseen. Rarely were. They depicted in the tomb art that celebrated the afterlife. Their craft was hidden, their names forgotten. The tombs show images of gods, of feasts, of harvests in the eternal fields, but not of the hands that wrapped the linen, not of the men who whispered the spells. Their secrecy endured, just as their work endured in the preserved bodies that survive even today. And so, when archaeologists open a tomb and find a mummy, they see not only the face of the deceased, but the invisible labor of embalmers long forgotten. Every strip of linen, every resin coating, every amulet hidden inside is a trace of their unseen craft. The silence of their chambers lives on in the silence of the tomb. If you imagine the closing of that chamber, the embalmers extinguishing their lamps, the family leading the coffin away, you might pause on one final question. Did those embalmers, men whose names history never recorded, realize that their work would endure for thousands of years? Did they know that long after their own bodies had turned to dust, the mummies they prepared would survive, watched not by Anubis, but by foreign archaeologists, museum visitors, and now you listening here in the present? Wrapped in eternity, the craft of linen in the mummification process, you picture the image of an Egyptian mummy. The first thing you likely see is not the face, nor the coffin, but the wrappings, layer upon layer of linen, binding the body into a new form, turning flesh into permanence. Linen was more than a material. It was the very fabric of eternity. Without it, embalming would have been incomplete. Yet to understand this simple textile is to uncover a quiet history that runs through the daily life of ancient Egypt fields. Of flax swaying by the Nile, women at looms in dusty courtyards, apprentices cutting long strips, priests whispering over knots of cloth. The story of linen is the story of how the Egyptians clothed both the living and the dead. The journey of linen began long before it reached the embalmer's chamber. Along the floodplains of the Nile, flax grew in abundance. Each year, when the river receded after its annual inundation, farmers planted flax alongside barley and wheat. Its stems rose in thin green stalks, topped with delicate blue flowers that lasted only a short time before fading. From these stalks came the fibers that, once spun, became linen, the most valued textile of Egypt. Unlike wool, which carried associations of impurity, linen was light, breathable, and symbolically pure. The gods themselves were thought to wear garments of shining white linen. Harvesting flax was laborious. The stalks were pulled up by the roots rather than cut, to preserve the length of the fibers. They were then dried in the sun, after which the seeds were removed by combing. The real work began in the retting process, where the stalks were soaked in water, sometimes in shallow pools, sometimes in the Nile itself, so that the outer layers softened and loosened. Once retted, the fibers were beaten, split, and combed until thin strands could be spun into thread. This spinning was most often done by women, who twisted the fibers with spindles, working steadily to produce the endless rolls of thread that Egypt required. From thread, looms produced the cloth. Archaeological evidence and tomb paintings show. Upright looms where women wove strips of linen in long, narrow pieces. The width of the cloth varied, but much of it was destined for everyday garments, tunics, kilts, veils. Linen was so ubiquitous that taxes could even be paid in cloth. A family's wealth was measured not only in grain or cattle, but in the amount of linen stored in its chests. Linen garments were given as gifts, as temple offerings, and as wages. It was a fabric woven into the very economy of Egypt. Yet, beyond its role in daily life, linen held sacred significance. Its whiteness symbolized purity. Priests serving in temples were required to wear freshly laundered linen before approaching the gods. Linen cloth was offered in great quantities to temples as gifts, sometimes inscribed with the names of donors. In hymns, the gods themselves were described as shining in linen robes. Thus, when it came to preparing the dead, linen was the only acceptable material. To wrap a body in linen was to clothe it as the gods were clothed, to present it purified and worthy of eternity. Inside the embalming workshop, bundles of linen awaited their turn. Some were cut into narrow strips, others kept as sheets for shrouds. The embalmers did not use any cloth at random. Specific pieces were chosen, sometimes inscribed with prayers, sometimes tied with knots of magical significance. The process of wrapping required hundreds of yards of cloth for a wealthy burial. A single mummy might be encased in layer after layer until the wrappings themselves formed a body larger than the one it covered. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the embalming process as including linen bandages cut into strips glued with gum that acted like resin. Archaeological studies confirm this, showing how resins and oils were brushed between layers to strengthen the wrappings and preserve the form. The linen absorbed these substances, becoming stiff, fragrant, and durable. The body was thus not only wrapped, but encased, sealed in a cocoon of cloth and resin. But there is another layer to this story. The wrappings were not always plain. Some strips of linen carried writing spells from the Book of the Dead, names of gods, protective phrases inked in hieratic script. Others bore red or black markings, symbols meant to shield the deceased. Linen was thus transformed into text, into prayer, into a medium carrying the voice of eternity. The act of wrapping itself was ritualized. The embalmers did not simply wind strips around the body in haste. Each part of the body was wrapped in sequence, accompanied by recitations. Fingers and toes bound individually, hands crossed and swathed, arms and legs wrapped together, then the torso enclosed. The head received special attention, with layers carefully shaped to preserve its form. Between layers, amulets were inserted, scarabs, eyes, knots, anxage placed at a precise spot, each charged with protective meaning. Linen, therefore, was both clothing and container, binding and binding agent for the unseen powers of magic. What is striking is that linen, so ordinary in daily life, became extraordinary in death. The same fabric that clothed farmers and laborers also clothed kings in their tombs. But in funerary use, its role shifted from practical to sacred. It became the veil between mortality and eternity. Without linen, the preservation of the body would have been incomplete. Without linen, the prayers and amulets would have had no binding. Without linen, the body would not have been properly prepared for judgment in the hall of Osiris. Consider the work of preparing linen itself. Families sometimes donated their own household cloth for embalming, giving pieces of garments once worn by the deceased. Archaeological finds reveal wrappings cut from reused textiles, with faint traces of earlier hems or seams. To us, this might seem careless, but in Egypt it was meaningful. The deceased was wrapped not only in purity, but in fragments of life, pieces of the world they once knew. In this way, the wrappings carried memory, binding past and future. The sheer volume of linen required for a single burial was staggering. Some mummies contain over 300 yards of cloth. The labor to produce such an amount was immense: fields of flax, weeks of spinning, days of weaving. Each burial, therefore, represented not only a religious act, but an economic investment. It was linen, perhaps more than gold, that signified the wealth of a burial. Gold adorned the outside, but linen enclosed the body itself. And yet, for all this detail, one question lingers. How much did the linen matter to the deceased themselves? Did they believe, as priests insisted, that each layer added protection, that each knot carried magic? Or was it more the family's comfort, the assurance that they had done all they could to secure eternity for their loved one? Linen may have bound the body, but it also bound the hopes of the living, woven tightly into each strip. As you imagine the scene, the embalmer winding cloth, the apprentice brushing resin, the priest whispering words, you might picture the silence of the moment. No rush, no loudness, only the steady wrapping, the smell of resin, the rustle of linen. It is in this rhythm that the ordinary became sacred, that flax from the Nile's banks became the fabric of eternity. And so the question remains, when you look at a mummy in a museum today, wrapped in layer after layer, what do you see? Do you see only cloth, yellowed with age? Or do you see fields of flax swaying under the Egyptian sun? Women weaving at their looms, embalmers murmuring prayers, families offering their best fabric in hope. Linen was not just cloth. It was memory, labor, economy, purity, and magic, all bound together. But if linen was so essential, what did the embalmers do during the long wrapping process, day after day, to keep the ritual alive? And how did the quality, thickness, and layering of linen vary between the rich and the poor? The embalmer's workshop was not only a place of preservation, it was a place of transformation. If the first stages of mummification prepared the body, cleansing it and removing decay, then the wrapping was the act that consecrated it, turning mortal flesh into something eternal. Wrapping was not simply practical, it was deeply ceremonial, each fold a line of prayer, each knot a spell, each amulet a silent guard. We must imagine the chamber as dim, lit by oil lamps and perfumed by resinous smoke. On a low table, the body lay already anointed and dried, the work of many days. At its side, piles of linen strips had been cut and sorted, some long, some narrow, some wide, some reserved as full sheets. At the ready were small bundles of amulets, carefully prepared by artisans and priests, scarabs, ankhs, jedpillar, eyes of Horus, knots of Isis. Jars of resin and gum stood open, sticky and fragrant, used to glue the layers together. The work began with the extremities. The fingers and toes were each wrapped individually, a task requiring patience and care. Linen strips, narrow and delicate, were wound around each digit. As they did this, The priests murmured protective words, invoking the safety of each finger and toe so that the deceased might walk, gesture, and grasp in the afterlife. To the Egyptians, the body was not symbolic but reality would be needed again, part by part, and so every detail had to be preserved. The hands were then wrapped, sometimes left crossed upon the chest, sometimes placed straight at the sides depending on the era and the tradition of burial. Between the fingers, amulets might be slipped, small charms of faience or gold, perhaps a scarab to bring rebirth, or a miniature symbol of life. Each was brushed with resin before being set in place, sealed into the wrappings forever. Next came the limbs. Arms and legs were wrapped separately, then bound together with additional layers. In certain periods, priests recited passages from the Book of the Dead as they wound the strips, invoking spells for protection on the journey to the underworld. Each layer was smoothed with resin so that the cloth stiffened and held its form. The smell was sharp, sweet, and heavy, filling the room until it clung to the very walls. It was not only wrapping, but shaping. The embalmers used the strips to restore the outline of the body, padding hollows, building contours, giving the deceased back their form. In this way, linen became flesh's replacement, a sculpting medium as much as a shroud. Some mummies, under careful wrapping, took on a near statuesque appearance, smoothed and idealized. To the living, this was not artifice but restoration, the recreation of a whole and perfect form, suited to meet the gods. At intervals, larger sheets of linen were draped over the body, layered like garments. Some sheets bore inscriptions, written in ink by temple scribes, prayers to Osiris, spells to ward off demons, hymns to Ra. Others were plain but were folded and tied in ways rich with symbolism. Knots were of great importance, particularly the so-called knot of Isis, a looped form of binding that represented the goddess's power of protection. To tie such a knot while speaking her name was to place her presence directly into the wrappings, binding her guardianship around the body. The torso was wrapped with special care, for it contained the seat of the vital organs, now removed and stored in canopic jars. Linen was wound firmly to protect the cavity, resin binding it tight. In some burials, packets of aromatic herbs, natron, or small bundles of linen soaked in resin were inserted within the torso as substitutes for the organs, symbolically filling the void. Over the chest, amulets were placed in sequence, the heart scarab above all, heavy and inscribed, set at the center to protect the heart in judgment. For the Egyptians, the heart was the true soul of the person, weighed against the feather of mat in the afterlife. To ensure it did not betray the deceased, spells were inscribed upon the scarab, pleading that the heart not stand against its owner. Each stage of wrapping was punctuated by words. Priests recited known formulae: may your limbs be whole, may your head not be severed, may your bones be strong, may your flesh be renewed. Each utterance reinforced the act, as if the linen itself absorbed the power of the words along with the resin. Wrapping was not silent nor mechanical, but a rhythm of motion and speech, hand and voice working together. As the head was wrapped, care was taken to preserve its shape. Narrow strips outlined the chin and cheeks, building up a firm structure before wider bands enclosed the whole. In some cases, masks of cartonnage or gold leaf were added, covering the face with a radiant countenance. Yet even beneath such masks, the linen itself mattered. The layers of cloth were like veils, purifying the visage before the divine. Sometimes spells were written directly on the bands over the mouth, ensuring the deceased could speak again in the underworld, or over the eyes, so that sight would be restored. Between these layers, amulets continued to be added: an eye of Horus, to protect vision; an ankh for life; a jed pillar for stability; a tiny golden serpent to repel danger. The placement was not random, but exact, guided by ritual texts. A trained embalmer knew where each belonged, much like a physician knows the body's organs. To misplace an amulet was to risk leaving a part of the soul unguarded. The final wrappings enclosed the entire body, layer upon layer, sheet upon sheet, until the form was wholly transformed. At this point, some embalmers wound a net of red linen around the outside, dyed with ochre, symbolizing blood and rebirth. Others applied strips dipped fully in resin, which hardened to form a shell-like casing. Still others painted the outer layers with images, hieroglyphs, or even depictions of gods. By the time the wrapping was complete, the body was no longer just a body. It was a vessel of prayers, knots, amulets, resin, and lenina, sacred object, a thing remade. In its stillness lay enormous activity: the hands that had woven the flax, the voices that had spoken the words, the artisans who had carved the amulets, the priests who had murmured the spells. All were bound together in the wrapping, sealed into eternity. For us, unwrapping a mummy today might reveal the astonishing volume of linen layer upon layer, carefully placed. Some archaeologists in the 19th century recorded unwrapping a single body and finding hundreds of individual pieces, some long, some short, some reused from garments. They marveled at the patience required, at the methodical care. What they did not always see was the meaning in each layer, the ritual in each knot. To an Egyptian, the linen was not merely cloth, it was a wall of protection, a shield of prayers, a binding of magic. Even the knots themselves were considered powerful. The knot of Isis, tied in red, represented the blood of the goddess and her binding force. A knot tied without words was only fastening, but a knot tied with invocation became a seal of divine power. Thus, the embalmers did not tie casually. They tied as priests, each loop a spell. When the final bandage was laid, the body stood at the threshold of eternity. What had begun as flax in the Nile fields, spun into thread, woven into cloth, cut into strips, had now become a second skin, a cocoon. The deceased lay not naked, not vulnerable, but clothed in divine fabric. Wrapped in linen, they were wrapped in eternity itself. And yet, questions remain. How much variation was there between one burial and another? Did the wealthy receive more layers, more knots, more amulets? Did the poor still have their fingers wrapped one by one, or were their burials swift, their wrappings sparse? In every case, though, the idea endured that without linen, without the ritual of wrapping, there could be no safe passage. The cloth was the bridge, and to cross without it was unthinkable. The wrapping had gone on for hours, sometimes days, as each layer of linen was laid carefully upon the body, accompanied by words of prayer, gestures of reverence, and the steady rhythm of ritual. By this stage, the form that lay on the table was no longer the vulnerable frame of a once living person. It had become something transformed, encased in silence. A figure sculpted by cloth and resin, its very presence solemn and otherworldly. Now came the completion. The final layers were not simply about protection. They were about sealing, closure, and presentation. What was to be done here would not only safeguard the body, but consecrate it as a sacred object, ready to meet the gods. The embalmers began by laying full sheets of linen over the entire form, smoothing them carefully so that no crease disrupted the outer surface. These were not ordinary strips, but whole cloths, like garments for the dead, draped with deliberation. Some were plain white, purified by natron, while others bore dyed borders or inked inscriptions, words drawn from the book of the dead or hymns. To Osiris, in some burials, these outer sheets functioned almost like a sacred text wrapping the body, their words enclosing the deceased in a cocoon of speech. Resin was brushed across these final layers, sticky and dark, binding them in place. The scent filled the room, acrid and sweet, clinging to the hair and robes of the men who worked. Each brushstroke sealed not just the cloth, but the prayers embedded within it, fusing word, fabric, and body together. Once hardened, the resin formed a glossy sheen, a skin-like surface that gave the form both weight and permanence. At this stage, the placement of external amulets and protective devices was completed. On the outer wrappings, across the chest, or down the length of the torso, the embalmers sometimes tied broad sashes of linen into knots of Isis, dyed red with ochre, calling upon the goddess's eternal protection. Large winged scarabs might be set upon the wrappings, or a broad collar made of faience beads placed across the chest to imitate the jewelry worn in life. Each piece was not decoration alone, but spell made visible, a charm that the gods themselves could see and acknowledge. Once the amulets were set, the body was enveloped in a shroud of plain white linen, drawn tight and knotted with ritual words. This outer shroud was not merely to cover, but to enclose the last skin between the world of the living and the journey to the dead. It was sometimes fastened with rope or linen cords, each tied with incantations that locked the magic in place. The cords were often sealed with resin or even clay impressions, like locks that could not be broken without divine sanction. The sealing of the wrappings marked the body's completion as a mummy. The deceased was no longer regarded as a person, but as a divine image, a sacred form. Priests gathered around, lifting incense burners so that clouds of frankincense and myrrh wreathed the chamber. The smoke was not simply fragrant, but purifying, a medium through which the spirit might be drawn closer to the gods. It was now that the opening of the mouth ritual might be performed, one of the most crucial rites of all, though technically directed at statues and coffins. The mummy itself could be the focus of this ceremony. A priest, wearing the mask of Anubis, touched ritual tools to the mouth of the wrapped body, speaking words to restore speech, breath, and sight in the afterlife. Without this, the deceased would be mute and blind before the gods. With it, they would be made whole, able to speak their name and claim their place in eternity. The linen thus did not end the body's story, but prepared it for this climactic rite. It acted as the stage on which the final ritual was enacted, the completed wrappings forming the vessel into which life was symbolically reawakened when the prayers were finished and the tools withdrawn. The mummy was ready to be presented. The embalmers and priests stepped back, their work done, their murmured voices fading into silence. What had lain before them was now a sacred object, a being wrapped in eternity, consecrated for the passage to the tomb. The body was lifted with care, often placed in a coffin already decorated with hieroglyphs, paintings of gods, and protective texts. Sometimes several coffins were nested, wood within wood, each carved and painted, so that the deceased lay like a jewel within layers of caskets, linen within wood, wood within stone. Each casing echoed the principle of wrapping layer upon layer, protection upon protection, an architecture of eternity. When family and mourners were allowed to view the body, they saw not a face but the wrapped form, gleaming with resin, tied with knots, inscribed with prayers. They saw the transformation that had taken place. The father, mother, husband, wife, or child was no longer simply the person they had known, but a vessel sanctified for the journey to the next world. The linen had erased decay, concealed mortality, and offered instead a form radiant with magic. The presentation was not without sorrow, but it was also solemn assurance. The wrappings promised continuity, that the beloved would endure, that they had been sealed against harm, that their spirit would walk again in the fields of the blessed. To those left behind, the sight of the bound form was a comfort, a visible sign that the ritual had been properly completed, that no stage had been left undone. Finally, the mummy was ready to be taken from the embalming chamber to the tomb. Wrapped, sealed, consecrated, it was carried in procession, accompanied by priests, incense, lamentations, and songs. The linen wrappings, hidden beneath coffins and shrouds, would never be seen again by living eyes. Yet, for the Egyptians, they remained the most important work, the foundation upon which the afterlife rested. The wrapping was thus both end and beginning. It ended the long labor of embalming, closing the body forever from decay and the touch of the world. But it also began the eternal life of the deceased, their journey clothed in the fabric of the Nile, sealed with spells, bound with the knots of Isis. To us, the layers of linen may appear as mere cloth, yellowed and brittle with time, yet in each fold lies the trace of hands that worked with reverence, the memory of voices reciting prayers, the lingering perfume of resin and incense. It was no simple task of burial, it was the making of a god, the clothing of the dead in eternity itself. And so, with the final knots tied, the cords sealed, and the shroud in place, the deceased was no longer vulnerable flesh. They were Osiris. They were transformed. They were eternal. Wrapped in linen, they were wrapped in eternity. The smell of preservation, oils, resins, and perfumes of the embalmers. When you imagine an ancient embalmer's chamber, you may first think of silence, of flickering lamps, and of linen spread in neat, folded stacks. Yet before the body was wrapped, before a single amulet was placed between the folds, the work of preservation carried another, less visible present scent. The ancient Egyptians believed smell could bridge the human world and the divine, and so, when they prepared the body of the dead, they worked as much with fragrance as with fabric. The oils, resins, and perfumes that were brought into that hidden space were not chosen by chance. They were gathered from across deserts, from mountain slopes, and from ships arriving at harbors with cargoes from distant lands. Step slowly into that quiet chamber in your mind, and you would notice how different. It smelled from the dust of ordinary life, Outside, in the streets, there was the odor of bread baking, of animals in the market, of Nile water turning slowly in the heat of the afternoon. But here, in the still air where a body waited to be made eternal, the air was infused with cedar, with myrrh, with pine resin, and with oils pressed from seeds and flowers. These were not the scents of everyday life. They were the scents of eternity. The meaning of smell in Egyptian belief. To the Egyptians, smell was not just a fleeting sensation of the nose. It was tied to purity, to holiness, and to survival in the afterlife. Incense was burned in temples not merely to sweeten the air, but to make the presence of the gods manifest. The bar, the soul bird of a person, could be drawn by fragrance, just as worshippers were drawn by the rising smoke of incense that curled upward in thin blue ribbons against the painted ceilings of sanctuaries. The dead, they believed, must not carry with them the staleness of decay or the scent of the desert heat upon a lifeless body. Instead, they must pass through the threshold of eternity wrapped in a fragrance pleasing to the gods. Smell, in this way, was thought of almost as an offering itself, just as bread and beer might be left in a tomb, or just as a painted mural might show the harvests and herds meant to sustain the soul. So too the air around the dead must be filled with the perfume of sanctity. To be embalmed was not only to be preserved from decay, but to be consecrated through scent. The origins of oils and resins, where did these fragrant substances come from? To answer that, one must look beyond the chamber itself and trace the long paths of trade that carried them into Egypt. From the mountains of Lebanon, ships brought cedar oil pressed from the great trees that once covered those slopes. The wood itself was prized for temple doors and ship timbers, but its oil carried antiseptic qualities and, more importantly, a powerful aroma that lingered long after it was applied. From the arid lands of Punt, somewhere along the Red Sea's distant shores, caravans and ships carried myrrh and frankincense. These were precious resins, bled from the bark of small desert trees, hardened into amber-colored lumps, and then ground, burned, or dissolved in oil. Their fragrance was sharp, bittersweet, and unlike anything grown along the Nile's banks. Closer to home, in the marshlands and groves of the delta, Egyptians gathered juniper, berries, and lotus blossoms. The lotus, with its head rising pure from the muddy waters, became a symbol of rebirth and eternal life. Its scent, extracted into oil, was considered the very essence of renewal. There were also the thick, sticky resins of pine, the black heaviness of bitumen drawn from the earth, and the lighter floral scents of pressed olive or castor oil. Some substances were practical, sealing the pores of the skin against decay. Others were symbolic, carrying meanings of light, rebirth, or divine favor. Thus, when embalmers prepared their storerooms, they laid out not only jars of natron salts and rolls of linen, but also a small treasury of flasks, alabaster vials, and clay jars. Each contained a scent that had traveled far and carried with it a memory of sacred groves, mountain slopes, or desert caravans. The embalmer's storehouse, you might imagine. Then, the storehouse of an embalmer, not as a single dark room filled with dust, but as a carefully ordered collection. Along one wall stood shelves with clay jars sealed with linen and wax, each holding oil pressed from olives or castor seeds. Next to them were small alabaster vessels, cool and smooth, containing The resins of frankincense, or myrrh, in baskets lined with reeds might rest bundles of aromatic herbs, juniper, coriander, and perhaps even cinnamon from lands beyond Egypt's horizon of trade. Every item carried a cost, and each substance was weighed carefully. Not all embalmings could afford frankincense from Punt or cedar oil from Lebanon. Many relied on more local substances, mixtures of conifer, resin, beeswax, and plant oils. Yet even the simplest materials were used with a sense of reverence. The embalmers knew that every scent, whether humble or rare, was an ingredient in the recipe of eternity. The first application, when the body had been cleansed and dried in natron. The moment came when oils and resins would first be applied. This was not simply a matter of brushing liquid across the skin. It was done with ritual words, with deliberate slowness. Imagine the embalmer dipping a small bundle of linen or a reed brush into warm oil and smoothing it along the arm of the deceased, the scent of cedar or lotus filling the chamber. The body, once inert and dry, began to shine with a subtle sheen of oil. Some of these substances were practical, softening the skin that had been desiccated by salt, filling cracks, and preventing brittleness. Others were applied because of their perfume, masking any remnant of human decay and transforming the body into something more than flesh. The Egyptians did not wish the gods to see or smell a body as ordinary. They wished them to encounter a form already touched by divine fragrance. The layers of scent built slowly. A mixture of myrrh and resin might be rubbed into the torso, juniper or pine resin into the cavities, and lighter floral oils brushed across the face. Each left a trace, and together they blended into a fragrance unique to the embalmer's crafter. Fragrance that, once smelled, could not be mistaken for anything else. The atmosphere of the chamber stepped back again into that imagined room. The air is heavy, not with smoke, but with the mingling aromas of warm oils and sticky resins. The smell is sweet and sharp, woody and floral, bitter and honey-like all at once. To the embalmers, this was the smell of sacred work, a signal that the process was unfolding properly. It is not hard to picture how a person entering from the outside world would have been struck by it. The marketplace smelled of garlic and onions, the river of silt and fish, the fields of straw and sweat. But here, inside the embalming house, one breathed a different atmosphere. It was as though the air itself had crossed a threshold. Ordinary life was kept outside. Eternity, perfumed and consecrated, lived within. The ritual importance. Why such attention to scent? Because, in Egyptian belief, the senses carried over into the afterlife. The dead were expected to see, to eat, to breathe, and to smell, just as tomb paintings provided fields and feasts to gaze upon, and just as offerings of bread and beer provided taste, so too fragrance provided breath. The sweet smells of oils and resins were thought to be what the deceased would inhale in eternity, the invisible food of the soul. Smell was also tied to divinity itself. Gods were described as having fragrant bodies, their presence revealed in the scent of incense. To surround the dead in perfume was to make them godlike, to align their presence with that of Osiris, Lord of the afterlife. The long memory of fragrance even centuries later, when tombs were broken open by robbers or rediscovered by archaeologists. Faint traces of these resins remained. Jars cracked open, released, for a fleeting moment. The same sharp bite of myrrh or the heavy sweetness of pine resin that embalmers once breathed. The oils themselves had long dried, but their ghosts lingered in the fibers of linen, in the blackened residue of jars, in the hardened resin clinging to ribs and bones. That endurance of scent was itself a kind of victory over time. The work was never meant to last a decade or a generation, it was meant to last forever. And so, when we read of the smell of cedar still clinging faintly to a mummy unwrapped in the 19th century, we are, in a way, breathing the same air as those ancient embalmers, sharing for a brief moment the atmosphere of their chamber and an unfinished question. So, when we picture the gathering of oils and resins, the filling of alabaster jars, and the first slow brushstrokes of cedar oil across the skin of the dead, we are not simply imagining practical steps of preservation. We are entering into a philosophy of eternity shaped by fragrance. Smell was not secondary, it was central. It made the invisible world of the gods present in the visible body of the deceased. And yet, a question lingers. Was the embalmer himself moved by those scents? Did he, after hours bent over the body, carrying the fragrance of myrrh and cedar upon his hands, walk home at night through the village with the smell of eternity still clinging to his skin? The embalming chamber, dim and enclosed, was not simply a place where flesh was prepared, was a vessel of transformation, a crucible where the body of a human being was slowly steeped in eternity. If you could step back into one of those quiet stone rooms of the New Kingdom, you would notice that the atmosphere was not only heavy with silence, but also with fragrance. The air itself carried the weight of cedar, myrrh, frankincense, and resin. They were not applied all at once, nor were they chosen at random. Each substance had its moment, its precise time and place in the ritual, just as linen layers were. Wound with deliberation, so too were oils and resins brushed, poured, anointed, and sealed in a sequence that carried practical necessity and sacred meaning side by side. The embalmer would begin with the body, already dried from its 40 days of natron. The skin had tightened and darkened, the form reduced to something leaner, more skeletal. Without oils, it would remain brittle, lifeless in the most literal sense. The oils were there to restore suppleness, to moisten what had been parched, and to give the body back some semblance of human texture. But more than this, each oil was thought to carry divine attributes: cedar for cleansing, myrrh for consecration, juniper for fumigation, frankincense for purity, bitumen for sealing. One after another, they were brought into play. The first was cedar oil. Its sharp resinous scent carried a note of both freshness and solemnity, and it was believed to drive away corruption. In practical terms, cedar oil was mildly antiseptic, its natural properties useful for fighting decay. The embalmer would take a small vessel carved from alabaster or clay, dip a reed or strip of linen into the oil, and gently wipe it across the body's limbs. This was not a rough scrubbing, but a quiet anointing, a reminder that the body was no longer flesh in the ordinary sense, but a relic of sacred passage. Sometimes the oil was poured directly into the abdominal cavity, particularly if the body had been disemboweled during earlier stages of embalming. The smell of cedar lingered in the chamber, sharp, clean, and cutting through the closeness of the room. To the living attendants, it was a scent of reassurance, the smell of cleansing and transition. After cedar came myrrh. If cedar was sharp and purifying, Myrrh was warm and bittersweet, a resin drawn from the Commiphora tree of distant lands to the east. To the Egyptians, myrrh was not merely fragrant, it was sacred, a gift bound to the gods themselves. Its smell was gentler than cedar, but richer, deeper, resonating almost like a low chant in the background of the chamber. The embalmer would crush the resin into small pieces and dissolve it in oil, creating a mixture that could be spread across the body. Myrrh was applied especially around the mouth and chest, as if to consecrate the breath and the heart, two centers of vitality. In symbolism, myrrh was linked to rebirth and divine presence. To apply it was to bind the deceased to Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Next came frankincense, lighter and brighter than myrrh, a resin that gave off a smoky sweetness when burned, but that also infused oil when crushed. Frankincense was costly, drawn from Arabian trade, and its presence in the embalming chamber was a mark of reverence. Where myrrh grounded the ritual in solemnity, frankincense lifted it as though to open a path for the spirit. The embalmer might place small grains of it near the nostrils and mouth, a symbolic act of purification. Some frankincense would be burned during the rites, its smoke curling upwards, filling the space with pale spirals of fragrance. This smoke was thought to carry prayers, lifting them beyond the chamber's stone ceiling toward the divine resins. From pine and juniper also had their part to play. Pine resin was sticky, viscous, and aromatic, its scent immediately recognizable as woody and protective. It acted almost as a glue, sealing the pores of the body and locking in what had been dried and preserved by natron. Juniper berries, when crushed, released an earthy fragrance that fumigated the air and drove away insects. These were not random folk remedies, but carefully chosen agents that blended medicinal strength with ritual function. A thin layer of resin might be brushed over the skin, hardening into a varnish-like sheen. To the embalmers, this sealing was more than physical, it was spiritual. The closing of the body against disorder and chaos. Bitumen, known to the Egyptians as asp, was darker, heavier, and less fragrant than the others. Yet it was one of the most decisive substances in the embalmer's repertoire. When heated and liquefied, it could be applied over the wrappings as a black, tar-like coating. In practice, it preserved by suffocating bacteria, but in symbolism, it marked the body with the deep color of Osiris, the god of resurrection, who was often portrayed with dark green or black skin as a sign of fertility and rebirth. Bitumen gave the mummified body its iconic deep hue. The embalmers worked carefully with it, for it was messy and difficult, but they did so knowing its dual role as both preservative and divine symbol. The application of these substances was not hurried. It was done with pauses, with murmured prayers and gestures of reverence. Oils were not slathered carelessly, but layered, each with its own moment. Cedar first to cleanse, myrrh to consecrate, frankincense to purify, resin to seal, bitumen to finish. Between each stage, the embalmer might stop, dip his hands into a small basin, and whisper words from the Book of the Dead or from older spells. These were not loud incantations, but soft murmurings, almost like the hum of bees, blending with the scents in the chamber until the atmosphere itself seemed alive with presence. What is most striking when we reconstruct this sequence is how the scents must have layered upon one another. Imagine the sharp bite of cedar oil, followed by the warm bitterness of myrrh, then the bright sweetness of frankincense. Over this base lay the sticky woodiness of pine resin and the dark heaviness of bitumen. The embalming chamber became a place of scent as much as sight or touch, and for those who worked within it, the blending of fragrances became a kind of map of the ritual itself. To breathe in that atmosphere was to follow the journey of the body from dried flesh to sanctified form. Even the jars and containers used to hold these substances carried their own significance. Alabaster jars kept oils cool and safe, their milky stone surfaces glowing faintly in the lamplight. Small clay bowls held resins in solid form, while bronze instruments might be used to heat and liquefy them before brushing them onto the skin. Nothing was improvised. Every tool and vessel had its place, and every motion of the embalmer's hand was part of a ritual cycle. And so, over the course of hours, or even days, the body slowly absorbed this layering of oils and resins. The skin grew less brittle, more supple, darkened by resins, enriched by oils, and sealed against time. To the embalmers, this was not preservation in the modern scientific sense, it was consecration. The body becoming the image of Osiris, the smell of the divine infusing what had once been mortal. Yet, one cannot help but wonder, did the embalmers themselves ever grow overwhelmed by the scents? Did cedar sting their noses? Did frankincense make their eyes water? Did the heavy black bitumen cling to their skin? For them, such discomfort may have been a necessary burden, a sign of laboring in sacred work. The chamber itself must have smelled so strongly that even stepping outside would carry the fragrance into the open air. Those who lived nearby might have known, from scent alone, when an embalming was underway. And in this, there lies a curious thought, that while we often speak of mummification in terms of sight, the bandages, the painted coffins, the golden masks, it was equally an affair of smell. The embalmers worked not only with their hands and eyes, but with their noses, immersed in an olfactory world that few today can fully imagine, in the quiet layering of oils, resins, and perfumes. The embalming chamber was transformed into a kind of temple where scent was the language of eternity. But what happened when the layering was finished? How did these fragrances linger as the body moved into the final stages of wrapping and sealing? And how were they experienced by the mourners, who would eventually approach the coffin? The body, now anointed with cedar, myrrh, frankincense, and the darker sealing resins, did not remain bare for long. The embalmers knew that oils and resins could only perform part of their duty if left exposed. To be effective both in the practical task of preservation and in the sacred task of sanctification, they had to be enclosed, bound in layers of linen that would hold them close to the skin, pressed into the folds, and interwoven with the fabric of eternity itself. Thus began the long and quiet work of wrapping. Wrapping was not a hurried act. It unfolded as a ceremony stretched over days, even weeks, each strip of linen placed with care, each fold accompanied by words whispered from memory. The embalmers did not simply bind the body in one continuous sheet. Instead, they layered the wrappings toe by toe, finger by finger, limb by limb, each section addressed and consecrated before being united into the whole. Between each layer, oils were brushed, resins dabbed, perfumes sprinkled. Linen alone was not enough. It had to be impregnated with fragrance, so that the cloth became both barrier and offering. The linen itself was often steeped beforehand in solutions of resin or gum, stiffening as it dried, so that by the time it was wrapped around the body, it formed a casing more like hardened bark than mere cloth. Other strips were left soft, pliant, able to absorb the oils and hold them close. Together they created a rhythm of texture, one layer stiff and protective, the next supple and fragrant, the next again rigid, until the body was cocooned in alternating veils of fabric and scent. As this work progressed, the air in the embalming chamber grew denser still. The sharpness of cedar oil mingled with the sweetness of frankincense, which in turn was anchored by the bitter richness of myrrh. Every new layer released another wave of fragrance, as oils were brushed onto the linen, or resins melted and pressed into seams. The embalmers themselves became infused with the smell, their hands and clothes carrying it, so deeply that they must have walked through the streets of their city, trailing faint clouds of the embalming chamber with them. Symbolically, the layering of fragrance into the wrappings had profound meaning. To the Egyptians, linen itself was a substance of purity white, woven from flax, associated with ritual cleanliness. But linen was also fragile in the face of time. Oils and resins, by soaking into it, made it durable, gave it strength against insects, damp, and decay. On a spiritual level, the binding of fragrance into the cloth meant that the deceased was enveloped not merely in fabric but in the breath of eternity. The very air of the gods, distilled into resin and oil, became the atmosphere the dead would carry with them into the afterlife. The embalmers also inserted small packets of resin-soaked linen between the layers, especially at the throat, chest, and abdomen points of power in the body, places where life had once resided. Sometimes amulets were added, pressed into the resin, so that they clung in place, each inscribed with spells of protection. The smell of these resin-soaked bundles must have been strong and enduring, resin hardening like amber over the sacred. Charms it held at intervals. The embalmers paused their work to burn incense, so that smoke mingled with the tangible application of oils. If one were to stand in the chamber at such a moment, one would see not only the body slowly vanishing under linen, but also thin threads of smoke drifting upward, curling into the dim air, perfuming the chamber beyond the body itself. The smoke was not wasted. It was a signal to the gods, an olfactory bridge between the earthly preparation and the divine reception awaiting the soul. Eventually, after many days, the wrappings reached completion. The body no longer resembled flesh and bone, but a sculpted form, smooth and sealed, its surface darkened by resin, its linen hardened into a carapace. Yet beneath those layers, fragrances remained trapped, the cedar that cleansed, the myrrh that consecrated, the frankincense that purified, the resin that sealed, the bitumen that marked with divine darkness. To unwrap such a body, something only robbers or modern archaeologists would ever dare, was to release once more those ancient scents, preserved like prayers in a vessel of time. And then came the moment when the embalming chamber gave way to the funerary rites. The body, swaddled and fragrant, was carried from the secretive place of preparation into the presence of mourners. The air of the funeral, too, was heavy with scent, though now it mingled with the smells of burning incense, fresh flowers, and the dust of the procession route. For those who followed the coffin, the perfumes clinging to the wrappings were part of the atmosphere of grief and reverence. To draw close to the coffin was to breathe in the same oils and resins that had been sealed beneath linen in the embalmer's hands. The funeral itself was a pageant of sensory richness. Priests waved censers of burning incense, filling the air with clouds of frankincense smoke. The sweetness of it was both uplifting and overwhelming, almost dizzying in closed spaces. Women hired as mourners wailed with high voices, while musicians played slow rhythms, their notes punctuated by the occasional crackle of resin on the charcoal of braziers. Even the desert sun must have seemed muted against the density of scent and sound. The coffin, fragrant and darkened with resin, lay at the center of it all, the culmination of weeks of perfumed labor. For the family of the deceased, these scents carried messages beyond their immediate sensory impression. To smell frankincense was to know the presence of purity. To smell myrrh was to sense consecration. To smell cedar was to trust in cleansing and protection. The funeral became not merely a rite of passage, but a gathering of fragrances, each bound to memory and meaning, each sealing the identity of the dead within layers of sacred association. And when the coffin was lowered into its tomb, when the chamber was sealed with stone, when the mourners departed and silence fell once more, those scents did not vanish. They lingered in the darkness, absorbed into linen, resin, and wood, held fast by the dry air of the tomb. Millennia later, when archaeologists broke open these chambers, they sometimes reported faint but distinct odors still present: the ghost of cedar, the wisp of resin, the suggestion of a perfume once strong enough to dominate the air of an embalming room. These traces, fragile yet undeniable, were the final testimony of the embalmer's work. It is a strange thought that across 3,000 or 4,000 years, scent could survive. Unlike gold or stone, it was never meant to be eternal in its material form. Yet because oils soaked into linen, because resins hardened like amber, because tombs remained sealed against moisture, the fragrance endured in echoes. To hold a strip of ancient linen, still faintly perfumed, is to touch not only a relic of the body it once wrapped, but also a fragment of the atmosphere in which it was consecrated. In this way, embalming was not just the preservation of form, it was the preservation of smell. The Egyptians believed that eternity had to be approached with every sense prepared: the sight of a perfected body, the sound of hymns, the taste of offerings, the touch of linen, and the smell of sanctity. The embalming chamber ensured that when the dead breathed again in the halls of Osiris, their very bodies would carry with them the fragrance of the divine. And so, when we look back now upon those darkened wrappings, we should remember that they are not merely bandages stiffened with age. They are layers of scent, sealed into cloth, meant to rise like smoke into the invisible world. They are, in their own way, a perfume still exhaling across time, an olfactory whisper of eternity. Salt of the desert, how natron became the powder of immortality, if you imagine for a moment the silent, dry expanse of the Egyptian desert, the wind moving gently across the empty lake beds where water once shimmered but had long since vanished. You will begin to sense the landscape from which the embalmers gathered the material that would make their sacred work possible. For preservation in ancient Egypt did not come from gold, nor from any magical stone hidden beneath temples, but from something simpler, something resting in plain sight, spread across the desert's surface in pale, glistening crusts. This was natron, a natural salt born from evaporation. Collected in heavy bags, by workers who trudged across the dry basins with aching backs and sunburned skin. To the eyes of the Egyptians, however, these white crystals were no ordinary powder. They were the desert itself, condensed and purified, a fragment of eternity scattered across the land. Natron was more than one thing. In its common, daily use, it was a cleanser. Households across Egypt kept small stores of it to wash clothing, to scrub kitchen vessels, to clean the body after bathing. It whitened linen and cut through grease, leaving a scent that was dry, sharp, almost metallic in the nose. It was used to brush teeth, to make simple pastes that could polish, scour, and purify. Even in its humblest role, it carried the sense of renewal. What was soiled could be made clean again. This practical knowledge, spread across households, gave natron a reputation that reached far beyond the domestic sphere. Yet, when carried into the workshop of the embalmers, natron assumed a meaning far greater than its practical function. It was no longer just salt for cleaning. It became the material breath of the desert gods, the touch of dryness that banished corruption. Egyptians understood the world as balanced between order and chaos, between the green life of the Nile and the vast barrenness of the sands. Where the Nile gave birth to crops, the desert gave birth to eternity. Its dryness, its stillness, its refusal to change from one year to the next, all these things marked it as the realm where mortality could be suspended. Natron, lifted from the desert's veins, carried that same stillness. To pack it around, a body was to invite the permanence of the desert to enter flesh and hold it still forever. In the places where natron was gathered, the work was repetitive and slow. Dry lakes like Wadi Natron shimmered with pale surfaces where deposits formed naturally over centuries. Workers would scrape, collect, and sift the crystals. The desert sun beat down with an intensity that left skin cracked and eyes raw. The powder was fine enough to cling to their hands and arms, leaving a ghostly pallor on their bodies, as though they too were being dusted with eternity. They gathered it into woven sacks, heavy loads that had to be transported on the backs of donkeys, their hooves crunching across the brittle surface of the desert floor. From there, it would travel along tracks toward towns, villages, and temples inside the embalming workshops, the so-called warbet, or place of purification. These sacks were stored in low corners or in large clay jars, carefully sealed against dampness. The sight of natron was ordinary, almost dull, just pale white powder piled in heaps, without ornament or shine. But for those who worked with it, its very ordinariness was a kind of sacred truth. Immortality did not require extravagance. It required the persistence of something simple, repeated and constant. The embalmers, standing barefoot in the dimness of their chamber, knew that without natron all their prayers, all their wrappings, and all their oils would fail. This salt, silent and unchanging, was the foundation of eternity. One might picture an embalmer reaching into a jar of natron, his fingers brushing against the crystals, the fine grains sticking beneath his nails. The coolness of it, compared to the heat of the room, brought a subtle reminder of the desert winds at night, when the sand radiated away the sun's heat and left the earth hushed and brittle. To touch natron was to touch the boundary between the living body and the eternal form it would become. The embalmers handled it with the steady familiarity of craftsmen, but beneath their practical gestures lay reverence. Each handful represented not just a tool, but a bridge between this world and the next. The Egyptians had myths that bound natron to the divine. Some texts describe how the gods themselves were purified with natron before entering sacred spaces. Priests, before making offerings, would rinse their mouths with natron solution, believing it washed away impurity not only from the body but also from the words spoken in prayer. To place natron on the tongue was to let speech itself be made holy, so that the voice could carry properly to the gods. In this sense, natron was never only about death, it was about preparation, about readiness to stand in the presence of eternity. Whether in temple or tomb, it is important to remember that the embalmers themselves lived in close relationship with this substance. Day after day, year after year, their hands were dusted with its grains, their nostrils filled with its dry sting. They inhaled it as they worked, they rubbed it from their arms when the day was done, and they slept at night with its sharp scent lingering in their hair. For them, natron was not an abstract material. It was a constant companion, woven into the rhythm of their days. They became, in a sense, custodians of the desert, bringing its power into the fragile spaces of human flesh. If you imagine sitting in the place of purification, perhaps in the corner while the embalmers moved about their work, you would see jars of natrons stacked against the walls, their clay surfaces marked with soot from oil lamps. You would notice how often the embalmers paused to dip into those jars, lifting handfuls of powder, pouring them into basins, or spreading them across linen cloths. You would hear the soft crunch of grains spilling, a sound distinct from any other noise in the chamber. It was a dry, whispering sound, like sand shifting in the wind. The voice of the desert carried into the quiet work of preservation. There is a profound simplicity in this image. The transformation of a body from vulnerable flesh into something that could endure thousands of years was made possible by this substance that anyone could gather, that lay freely across the landscape. Unlike gold, which glittered but was scarce, natron was abundant and humble. Yet it achieved what gold could, not the arrest of decay. It is a reminder that history often hides its power in plain things. The embalmers, patient and methodical, saw no contradiction in this. To them, it was fitting that eternity should come from the most silent of materials, one that did not call attention to itself, but worked invisibly, deeply, and without interruption. In this way, natron was a gift of the desert one that required no temple walls to proclaim its holiness. It needed only the endless sun and the dry basins left behind when water receded. The desert itself was the temple, the whole land stretching outward in barren silence, its surface marked with the shimmering traces of salt. To scoop up that salt and bring it to the embalmer's chamber was to carry a fragment of the eternal desert into the fragile world of human bodies. And so, in the first days of the embalming process, before oils were applied or linens unrolled, natron made its quiet entrance. The embalmers would line up the jars, preparing for the long work ahead. They would look upon the lifeless body before them and know that this substance, plain and unremarkable to the eye, held the secret of stillness. Without it, flesh would soften, darken, collapse. With it, flesh would hold its shape, remaining recognizable even across the span of centuries. Natron did not promise immortality of the soul that belonged to other rites and prayers, but it offered immortality of the form, so that the soul would have a vessel to return to, a place to rest, a body to inhabit in the afterlife. As we pause, here In the dim chamber, with the jars lined along the walls, the lamps flickering, and the air dry with the powder of the desert, we are left with a simple yet unsettling question. How did the embalmers, year after year, come to see this humble salt not just as a tool, but as the very breath of eternity? When the body was first placed upon the table of purification, its weight still belonged to the earth. The flesh remained supple, the skin soft with the lingering moisture of life, and beneath it all, the heaviness of fluids that once carried blood, breath, and warmth. To transform that body into something capable of surviving eternity required a passage through stillness and dryness so complete that the forces of decay would be banished forever. This passage was not sudden. It was slow, patient, unfolding, across days and nights, until the body ceased to resemble the fragile flesh of the living and became instead a form, held steady by the desert's own breath. This was the long vigil of natron, the 40 days of drying. The embalmers began by preparing basins and troughs of the salt. In some instances, the body would be entirely submerged within heaps of natron, the crystals poured over it until it disappeared from sight. In other cases, the substance was carefully packed into linen bags and laid beneath, above, and around the form, so that every contour, every hollow, every curve of flesh was touched by the dry embrace. The most delicate work came with the cavities of the body, the embalmers using small scoops and hollow reeds would insert natron into the emptied spaces where the lungs had once expanded, where the intestines had once coiled, where the stomach had once digested the grain of the Nile. To leave these spaces moist was to invite ruin. To fill them with salt was to create silence within silence, dryness upon dryness, layer upon layer. The face, too, required careful attention. The eye sockets were gently padded with natron, not enough to distort the features, but enough to ensure no dampness lingered in those deep hollows. The mouth, sometimes stitched, sometimes left slightly parted, was filled with tiny measures of salt. Even the lips, delicate and prone to collapse, were rubbed with grains so that they would not soften and recede. It was a work of patience and restraint, guided by hands that knew how much was needed and how much might harm. Too little, and decay would whisper in through some hidden corner. Too much, and the form of the features, the likeness that the soul would one day recognize, might be lost beneath distortion. When at last the body was packed and padded, the embalmers stepped back, and the long waiting began. For 40 days, the body lay in stillness, embraced by the desert's powder. During that time, the chamber was quiet. The embalmers came and went, checking the state of the natron, replacing any grains that had grown clumped with moisture, scraping away damp sections and pouring in fresh, dry handfuls. The days unfolded in near silence, punctuated only by the soft sound of salt spilling from jars, the faint rasp of linen shifting, the flicker of oil lamps that burned without hurry. The passage of those 40 days cannot be rushed. It is not the kind of work that invites spectacle or ceremony. Instead, it is a vigil, a long, patient attendance. Each day, the embalmers would open the chamber and breathe in the dry sting of natron. They would bend close to the body, not to touch it, but to see how it endured. Already within the first week, the changes began. The flesh, once heavy with fluid, grew lighter. The skin, once smooth and pliant, began to stiffen. The form, once burdened by weight, became more rigid, its lines sharper, its presence more like carved stone than living tissue. By the second and third weeks, the transformation deepened. The body no longer smelled of mortality. The sharp sting of natron replaced any trace of corruption, so that the air around the form was filled only with the scent of the desert dry, clean, biting. The workers, leaning close, would feel the difference in their nostrils. Gone was the heaviness of flesh turning back to earth. In its place was the hollow sting of salt. For them, this was the surest sign of progress, more telling than any sight. The smell of stillness, the perfume of absence. The fourth and fifth weeks drew the body further from the world of the living. The cheeks sank inward, the skin tightened against bone, and the whole form seemed to grow smaller, more contained. Yet in that shrinking there was preservation. Nothing was wasted, nothing undone. Instead, the body was becoming an image of itself, a likeness drawn in sharper lines, purified of all softness. It was as though the desert had reached into the chamber and claimed the flesh as its own, holding it fast against the intrusion of time. The embalmers, though practical men, were not untouched by this transformation. They knew, as they tended the body each day, that they were witnessing a passage no less profound than the crossing of the soul into the afterlife. The flesh was traveling too, moving from one state of being into another, just as the spirit would. The slow drying was not only preservation, it was transition, a movement toward permanence. Their task was not to force or hasten it, but to allow it to unfold in its own time, guarded by their vigilance, guided by their hands when needed, left in silence when silence was enough. At the close of the 40 days, when the natron had done its work, the body was lifted carefully from its bed of crystals. The embalmers brushed away the clinging grains, shaking loose the powder that had attached itself to hair, skin, and folds of linen. What remained was no longer a body in the ordinary sense. It was a form of endurance, a vessel of dryness, a shape that had crossed the threshold from corruption to permanence. The embalmers did not rush this unveiling. Each brushing away of natron was deliberate, each movement respectful, as though they were not only revealing a preserved form, but awakening a new state of being. When at last the figure lay uncovered, the chamber filled with an almost palpable stillness. What had once been warm flesh, now long gone from the world of breathing, had been held steady against time by the desert's gift. The embalmers, standing with salt clinging to their hands, saw before them not the lifelessness of decay, but the likeness of a person who could still be known, still be recognized, even in the far future. It was a likeness made possible by patience, by vigilance, and by 40 days in the embrace of natron. Thus ended the longest chapter of the embalming, the silent vigil of dryness. Without these weeks, no oils could be applied, no wrappings could hold, no prayers could bind. With them, the foundation was laid for eternity. The 40 days of drying had been a vigil of silence, a waiting that tested the patience of both embalmers and family alike. But when it was complete, when the natron had withdrawn every trace of moisture, and the body lay still and firm, lightened of its earthly heaviness, the chamber of the dead was filled with a subtle shift. The long pause of waiting had ended. Now began the act of return. For though the body was preserved by dryness, it was not yet ready to stand in the eternal courts. It required a new garment, a new skin, a new covering through which it might be recognized by gods and men alike. That garment was linen, the winding cloth that would transform mere preservation into rebirth. The embalmers lifted the form from its salt bed with careful hands. The skin now held a brittle firmness, like parchment drawn tight over wood. The features, once soft with life, now bore the lean shadows of the desert, lips pressed thin, cheeks hollowed, limbs narrow and hardened. Yet this was not regarded as loss, but as readiness. The desert had stripped the body of all that was temporary. What remained was essence, a likeness unyielding to time, waiting to be clothed again. Before any linen was wound, the body was bathed, not with water, for water was the enemy now, but with sacred oils that soothed and softened the dried skin, restoring to it a sheen that caught the lamplight. These oils were poured with quiet reverence, rubbed gently across the forehead, along the arms, across the chest and legs, as though the deceased were being awakened with a final anointing. The scents of cedar, myrrh, and pine filled the chamber, mixing with the faint mineral sharpness of natron that still lingered in the air. For the embalmers, this was the moment when the silence of drying gave way to fragrance once more, as though the body were drawing breath again through its scented skin. The wrapping began at the feet. Linen strips, long and narrow, woven from the flax fields along the Nile, were dipped in resin to strengthen them, then wound carefully around the ankles and toes. Each binding was deliberate, each fold smoothed against the one before it, until the feet were no longer bare but clothed in fabric that symbolized renewal. From there, the wrappings crept upward calves, knees, thighs, limb embraced by linen. Each knot tied with spells whispered low in the chamber. The embalmers did not wind the linen in silence. Their work was accompanied by recitations from the Book of Going Forth by Day, words meant to guide the spirit on its journey. As the strips wound tighter, spells were spoken that bound not only cloth to flesh, but eternity to mortality. The linen was not simply fabric, it was word made visible, prayer woven into thread. Every layer carried both protection and command, to guard against corruption, to summon the soul to its rightful place, to keep hostile spirits away, to grant the deceased safe passage through the gates of the afterlife. Amulets were slipped between the layers, a scarab of green stone placed over the heart, a tiny golden eye of Horus at the throat, a knot of red jasper bound at the chest. Each amulet was more than ornament, it was a shield, a voice, a living symbol with power to intercede. When the soul stood before the weighing of the heart, the embalmers, with fingers skilled from years of practice, nestled these charms into their places as they wound the cloth, ensuring that when the body entered the halls of judgment, it would not stand unguarded. The arms were crossed upon the chest, and linen bound them there, as though in an eternal gesture of stillness and peace. Across the torso, layers were added again and again, thickening the body's form until it resembled not so much the fragile outline of human flesh, but the sturdy, timeless shape of a figure ready to endure centuries. The head, too, received its due attention. Delicate bands of linen wound around the jaw, across the cheeks, circling the crown of the head, building outward until the face was both concealed and preserved. Over the eyes, small pads of linen held shape and form. Over the mouth, careful wrappings ensured that the lips, though silent, retained their dignity. By the time the final layers were placed, the body no longer appeared as the dried, hollowed form that had emerged from the natron. It had been remade, reshaped, reintroduced into ritual life. What lay upon the embalming table was no longer a withered remnant of the past, but a vessel prepared for eternity, clothed in the white purity of linen. The transformation was not only physical, but spiritual. To the embalmers, the wrapped body was a symbol of the god Osiris himself, who had once been torn apart and then made whole again through ritual and devotion. To clothe the dead in linen was to clothe them in divinity, to let them share in the god's own victory over death. The chamber itself seemed to respond to this transformation. Where once the air had been sharp with natron and heavy with dryness, now it was filled with fragrance and quiet warmth. The linen rustled softly with each turn of the embalmer's hands. The oils gleamed faintly in lamplight. The amulets glimmered before being hidden between folds. The work was not hurried, for haste had no place here. Each layer was a step toward rebirth, each not a promise sealed in thread at last. When the wrapping was complete, the embalmers stepped back and regarded their work. The body lay firm, straight, encased in shining white, the scent of oils rising faintly from its surface. It was ready, no longer simply a body dried by salt. It was now a person clothed for eternity, restored to dignity, and reintroduced into ritual life. Soon it would be placed within a coffin, carried in procession, and laid within a tomb where prayers and offerings would continue the work begun here. For the embalmers, this was the moment of quiet satisfaction, when labor and patience converged into transformation. They had taken what was fragile and made it enduring. They had guided the flesh through death into permanence, and they had clothed that permanence in linen, so that it might be recognized by the gods as worthy of eternity. The desert had preserved, the linen had reborn. What lay before them now was not a body awaiting decay, but a form awaiting eternity.